That's a great pub you're in, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've downloaded quite a few backgrounds, over the last couple of years for these events. So
I feel like it could be it looks like a Tolkien kind of,
it could
definitely
be.
English pub.
Yeah.
I feel like there's one of those that looks just like that in Toronto. That's why I briefly thought you had like booked out a place, but
Yeah, it's probably pretty cheap right now with the pandemic, right? No
yeah,
indoor
absolutely.
dining. Great. Well, I think some people have popped in now, so I'd just like to welcome everybody to tonight's Theology Pub Night. This is a partnered event with the Meeting House in Wycliffe College, and this is our third year of doing it. We're very pleased tonight to have Danielle Strickland as our guest, and also Scott Mealey. I'll let them introduce themselves, but I'd just like to welcome everybody that's here tonight. So why don't we start with you, Danielle? Why don't you introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about what you do and who you are?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Danielle Strickland. I'm actually on the teaching team at the Meeting House. So that's this last year. So that's been lots of fun. I've really loved it. I am a speaker, communicator, writer. I spent 22 years of my life with the Salvation Army doing church planting and sort of justice initiatives, anti-trafficking things. And then I've launched a few initiatives that I love into the world that I still kind of cheerlead for. And yeah, I guess the best description of me is sort of a kingdom entrepreneur. I'm just always starting stuff and having a good time doing it.
Great, welcome. Well, when we had booked Danielle to come, it happened to be October 30th, and I thought, what better way to, kind of tie into the theme of the season, and with Halloween, to talk about her book, The Zombie Gospel. And I thought, who else could I bring to this evening? And I thought of my friend Scott Mealey, who watched The Zombie Gospel with me every Sunday night for, I don't know how many years we watched it for, 4 or 5 years. But I'll let you introduce a little bit about yourself, and I think it'll become apparent why you're a good fit for this panel. Scott, why don't you?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Scott Mealey. I live in Toronto now, but as we were talking about earlier, I am originally from the East Coast, so from Moncton. Spent a lot of years in Halifax. Was an actor at one point in my life, and then God upended that, and spent a number of years as a pastor and then a church planter, mostly to a church called The Pool. I wonder if there might be some poolies out there on the East Coast for people who had no church background, young adults. So did that for a while, and then after about 12 years of doing that, I felt like I was being called back into academia, and then just recently defended my dissertation at the University of Toronto, and I would sort of describe myself academically as an audience scholar, and which actually has a lot in common, really, with sort of understanding audiences was for me very similar to understanding the people that the church is often kind of reaching out to. And the church and the theater world have similar strengths and similar weaknesses. So I found a lot of cross connection there. I also am a co-director of what's called the Center for Spectatorship and Audience Research. And we're sort of working on finding empirical engagement with giving voice to people who go to see shows who are often not heard from in terms of artists and from other scholars. So that's what I am and what I do, and I almost went into film, so I'm excited to talk about film tonight. So.
Great. Yeah, so welcome both of you. I think this is going to be a wonderful discussion, but to start things off, I thought it might be good, Danielle, to give a little bit of background to the book. What prompted you to write this book? It's not the typical type of book that a Christian author may delve into, and yeah, why don't you give us a little of the backstory behind the Zombie Gospel?
Yeah, it's actually almost a bit of a nightmare for my sort of normal audience to try to market it in some ways, I think. But IVP was willing to give it a go. Basically, I thought that The Walking Dead was much like just sort of the typical, sort of Western, I don't know, thirst for more gore, more death. I just kind of dismissed it as this like appetite for destruction. And then I had, it just became a phenomenon. And a lot of my friends were like, but have you seen it? And I was like, no, but like, come on, like, and I was very dismissive of it. And then they just really challenged me and said, I think you probably need to see what all the fuss is about. So I watched the first season by myself with earphones in late at night. So because I had little kids and like my husband's not into it. So it was awesome actually to watch it at night by myself with the laptop and earphones. It was like scarier, but anyway. And then I just was shocked because what I heard was a cry, like I felt like I heard sort of a culture crying out for and asking probably the right questions, like basically the main question, which what does it mean to be human? And so the cry kind of got to me. And I was just thinking about the millions and millions and millions of people who, I mean, maybe not all of them were getting maybe some of the deeper things that were going on in the show, but certainly a lot of them. And it was resonating with them. And I just kind of felt like, I know a guy who told us what it meant to be human. Like I know some of the questions, I've been there too, and so I just really I was on an airplane on a long trip and pretty much half of that book just came out of me just with that, here's what's being asked and here's what's resonating and here's what I'd like to say. And could we at least have a discussion? And then I was also just talking to Christian adults who had kids who loved it. And they were they couldn't get into it. They couldn't discuss it with them. They just felt like there was just this gulf between, and even pastors and nobody knowing what to do with this genre and particularly the show. And so I thought maybe this would be helpful to them too. Maybe they could get a glimpse into how you could take, this cultural phenomenon and make it at least a means by which we could have a conversation at the very least about deeper things of the human condition.
And what's the reception been like? It's been out for a few years now, but
yeah, it hasn't been great. To tell you the truth, I think I don't, IVP wanted to do another book, so I guess they thought it was okay, but I wasn't thrilled. But I mean, part of the problem I think with a book like this is, and especially InterVarsity Press was trying to sort of push itself. So, it was the first time they ever went to a book festival that wasn't a Christian one, the year they published this. And this was kind of one of their titles that was there to try to cross the bridge. And so, it was a new thing for them. So I'm not sure that it resonated with their crowd in a weird way. And then, so anyway, I think it was just a hard marketing job, to tell you the truth, because it actually doesn't, if you're a total Walking Dead fan, you're all the way in, it probably doesn't hit you entirely because it's just light. It's like Walking Dead light in a way. But then if you're not a fan of the zombie gospel, then it doesn't hit you because it's so it was a bit of a niche.
Yeah. The Venn diagrams where it overlaps is kind of a little bit narrow.
Yeah. So we were going for this, even though what my idea was and actually we had some issues around the editing too, because I wanted to just save Jesus to the very end. Yeah. And they didn't. So there's some compromise there. I just wanted to have the discussion for most of the book. And then at the end say here's where most of my questions are resolved, or at least find some home. Right. And they needed Jesus to be more evident in each of the chapters. So It became a little bit different than what I had envisioned, but nonetheless, I was reading it, prepping for this pub night because I haven't read it for a while. Almost every Halloween, funny enough, I read it. And because I figure there's a good quote here on death and stuff. And I'm always a little surprised. It's just a tiny little book, but it's pretty punchy. I like it.
Yeah. We got a little poll for our audience. We have a couple of little audience engagement moments. And so, Terry, if you want to throw up the first poll for people. So we just want to see, of the people here tonight, how many people watch the show and just get a feel for that. Also, feel free to use the chat, and there's also a question box that you can fill out questions and upvote questions, and we'll get to some questions from the audience as well as the evening progresses. But yeah, just take a second to fill out our poll. Oh, somebody said that there's no option for academically obsessed zombie fans who still not have watched the show.
Yeah. It's true.
Yeah. I hear you, Christine. I almost left them too. So.
Are you guys still watching the show? Is anybody still watching? Are you still watching the show?
Yeah. We can't watch it together anymore because of COVID. So
COVID. You don't like just FaceTime each other and like chat while you're watching.
I guess we could, right, Scott? We could.
I guess
we could. I actually have rewatched it from the beginning with my son, which has also been really interesting. So yeah, that's been fascinating to get his perspective on it.
Wow. There is not a lot of people have watched it. So half are new to the show. I think the thing that,
how much are we allowed to talk about?
I don't know. We'll see. Maybe we'll get some more people interested. Maybe some more people will buy your book, and then more people will also watch the show. So that's maybe part of the goal tonight.
It's so funny, Steve, but like sometimes people like if I'll be at an event and there'll be a book table there and they'll want me maybe to sign a book and they'll be like, should I get this one? And I'm like, are you a fan of The Walking Dead? And they'll say, no, I've never seen it. And I'll be like, then don't get that one. Like, because I'm just like, I'm a little like, I don't want you to go watch The Walking Dead, but there were tens of millions of people watching it. So I guess just they weren't in the church, Yeah. So
can I just say, Danielle, I actually felt like, man, I wish you had like published it now, because in some ways it resonates more powerfully now in the moment we're all in, right? I think part of it's because we resonate with the idea of a pandemic, obviously. And what it's like to have our world upended in a more visible way. Not that it wasn't always true, but it's now more visible. So in some ways, I feel like it speaks in a really timely way to now. So anyway, maybe it'll have a resurgence. Maybe the Steve endorsement will give it the bump.
There's a lot of weight.
Yeah, maybe it needs a little rework, like just not just Walking Dead, but like the whole, apocalyptic reality.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue, Scott. In some ways, The Walking Dead, like people are just struggling to survive, and society as we know it has changed, and profoundly changed. And yeah, I think there are some parallels there. So Danielle, like when you kind of talk about what does it mean to be human, I think people like miss out, and there's a lot of people that haven't seen the show, but I don't know if you felt the same way, that after you start watching it for a while, the zombies almost become incidental to the story. Like they're there, they're a nuisance, they're annoying, but it's really about the relationships and those connections that people had. What struck you about this idea of like, what does it mean to be human?
Yeah, there's a couple things. So those of you who haven't seen the show, basically Rick, the main character, is a sheriff, and he wakes up in the hospital kind of disorientated, and everybody's gone except there are these like zombies everywhere consuming people. It's like just he wakes up to this world that's like complete, like the world as he knew it is completely gone, and there's this other world that's hostile, and everybody's suspect of everybody else because you don't know if you're actually a zombie or if you might have been bitten or if you're safe or not, because everybody goes into like total survivor mode. So I mean, this is, Scott, you're right about this. Like this is a great time to talk about this because you wake up one day and the world is like not as it was, and now everyone's trying to figure out what they're going to do. And so I think for me, I think it's true, the show becomes about the survivors of this apocalyptic event. And there are some moments of like, for a zombie effect, just gore and just like ridiculous, sort of displays of like, killing people, like killing zombies in the head and things like that. But for the most part, it becomes a story of this collection of people who are trying to survive. And this is where it's really interesting, because the survivors have to decide what kind of life they're going to live and what values they're going to live by. And like, is it okay to do anything to survive? Or is there a point in which surviving's not worth it? Like, and so you see these kind of parallel stories, like all kinds of these stories about like, what are you willing to do to survive, number one. And then also everybody coming to grips with their own capacity to do harm, like everybody coming to grips with this idea that like left to our own devices, we're just jerks. Like we're selfish jerks. So there are these like scenes in the first season that are just like always, you're never forgetting, like the best friend of Rick, in the end, he goes to get some supplies and he's all heroic, and they get, him and this guy, this really nice guy that brought them in. They're getting supplies. And then as they're leaving, the zombies are coming and he doesn't see a way out. So he just shoots in the leg, right? The guy that he's running away from the zombies with, so that the zombies will get him. And there's this moment, like, so that he'll survive. And he comes back as this hero and just kind of says he never made it, this other guy, but nobody else knows the real story. But what happens is really remarkable. What happens is that this guy who plays a great character, I can't remember his name. What is his name? The best friend of Rick that dies?
Shane. Yeah.
Shane. But Shane, you see that moment that he decided to sacrifice somebody else so that he would live and then hide it. It changes him. It shifts him. And then he actually loses himself. That's what happens. He loses who he is. He loses other relationships. And then eventually he's going to kill his best friend, and then he dies instead. But I think the point is just that and then that goes on and on and on through the show, is like people coming to grips with their own capacity for evil, their own capacity for selfishness. And then also this like hunger for, then this like realization that I've survived, but at what cost? And is it worth it? You know what I mean? Like, so I mean, those are like the essential questions about what it means to be human, like coming to grips with our own sense of, what is that? Is it Spufford that wrote how being a Christian makes incredible, amazing emotional sense? And he redefines sin in the book. He's from Cambridge, I think. And he wrote this book called How Becoming a Christian Makes Emotional Sense. It's really, he was like this avert atheist, and then he became a Christian. And he writes this book. And he basically says, sin, we say it just like so casually, but what we mean by sin is humans' capacity to F everything up. That's how he describes, and then he makes it an acronym. He just like literally lists that. So every time we would normally write sin, he writes human capacity to F everything up. And I think as you read that book, you're like, yeah, like there is a human capacity, like there is this. And I think that's one of the questions that's raised in at least the first season for sure, is like, number one, like, what does surviving even mean? Is it worth it? Am I human still? Like, what am I willing to do? And who am I becoming in this sort of quest to survive?
Yeah, I think that's one of the powerful pieces in the show, is that like everybody expects the zombies to embody the evil, right? And it's the good of the humanity versus the evil of the zombies. But very quickly you see the zombies are kind of neutral entities. The evil is within us, right? Like it's a very interesting turn that kind of turns your expectations. And yeah, I think that also in some ways Christianity has that kind of similar kind of thrust to it, where the expectation, is, the evil's out there, but really it's coming to grips with the evil inside each one of us, right? And yeah. Yeah. The other things that I thought were really interesting, and maybe we can take a little bit of time to talk about two characters. And I know you talk a little bit about the one for sure, Gabriel the priest, and the other one is Herschel, the father. And these are two religious figures in this story. And I know you kind of take one angle on it, but I'm interested in kind of discussing for a little bit what these characters mean, like how society sees religion, how society sees the church. And I think I'll just frame it the way I kind of saw these two characters, and we can play off of it a little bit. But I see Herschel is, this figure who is deeply devout and religious, but almost everything that he expected of his religion has not come true, and he still kind of holds on to that delusion that somehow it's all going to work out. But it's very clear, that people are disbelieving, his kind of whole framework for knowing how the world works. The other one is Gabriel, the priest that they meet in, I think, about season 5 or so. And it's just a really interesting character. So the story of Gabriel is they meet this priest, they save him, he takes him back to their church. But on the church's walls is scrawled in blood, these messages, like, you're going to burn for this. And it kind of turns out later that Gabriel actually locked his own parishioners out of the church, saving himself. And so on the one hand, you have like religious people are delusional, like Herschel still holding on to these beliefs, or religious people are like utterly selfish, and they're willing to sacrifice everybody else for their own personal gain. Those aren't flowery pictures of what the church or religion or Christianity is. I don't know if you picked that same vibe up or not, but maybe we can spend some time chatting about that.
Well, one of my favorite lines, of course, is Herschel when or it might be Maggie, but Herschel's daughter, when he says, when the Bible told me the dead were going to rise, I had no idea it could look like this.
Yeah.
It's such a great line. But I think that's a fair thing. I think Herschel comes out a bit better, to tell you the truth, because he's maybe a little bit out of touch. Like, people are sort of like, oh, brother, but actually his character, like who he is, he believes it and he lives it, and it makes a difference in how he lives. And I think in the end, people start looking to him for advice and for wisdom, and they realize that he has merged his faith into his life. So there is something about, like, he's living this. It's not just something that he's saying. And I think in juxtaposition with the priest, of course, Gabriel, he's saying this, but he hasn't lived this. So, like, in some ways, right? Like, at least at the beginning. And I think for me, and I think that's what I write about in the book, like I call the chapter "No More Priests," because I think one of the things the show's critiquing, but I also think just society's critiquing regularly, is that we've created some sort of religious hierarchy that priests should be better. Like, priests should be better, like professional Christians, the pastors should be better. And I mean, this still happens in our lives, where we're perpetually disappointed by the realness and the humanness and the brokenness that we find in our leaders, because we're surprised, because they're supposed to be better than that, or better than human, I suppose. And it's this like weird fake hierarchy. So what Gabriel's like, his journey is so much harder, because it's harder for him to get to his own brokenness and his own depravity. Like, it's harder for him to admit, and then the actual community, the surviving community, gets to a place where he says, where they say to people that want to join them, how many zombies have you killed? And they'll say, oh, like 10 or whatever. And then they'll say, how many humans have you killed? And if they won't admit, to having been involved in sort of the complicated nature of like the apocalypse, like of survival, then they say they're not ready to join the group, right? They're not, because they're not being honest with themselves. And so for me, I saw this definitely a critique of religion, that protects itself at the cost of the masses, which I think should be for Christians watching the show, it should be, obviously awakening for us. Like, is this what we're doing? Are we protecting ourselves, like locking ourselves in our churches while people are crying for help? This would be my tradition. The Salvation Army, William Booth is famous for a vision that he had called "Who Cares?" The vision's called "Who Cares?" And it was of people drowning by the masses in a sea, and everybody on shore sort of having theological symposiums, and other people playing games, and basically him just running around going like, can't you see people are perishing in the sea? Like, what are you doing? And it reminded me of that a little bit, like that, like, what is religion for? Like, what is the priest doing in that church? Why has he barricaded himself inside? So there's like a lot of imagery there. But I would say that Gabriel, the reason why people can't trust him is not just what he did, but his inability to be honest with himself about what he did, and then with others about what he did. And I would say that that's probably a pretty good critique of religious systems as they exist today. You know, I wish, in a sense, the Walking Dead community becomes like the classic NA or AA group that meets in the basement of a church, where finally there's some refreshing honesty about our own, you know, condition. And but Gabriel, I think that character is so complicated because it takes him a long, complicated time to get to the truth about his own self.
So, you know, it's interesting because it's interesting, these two characters, because I think in some ways they represent two problems that people who come into the kingdom struggle with. Herschel's problem is, well, it's kind of like remember when people come to the tomb and the angel says, why are you looking for the living among the dead, right? So Herschel continues to try to collect these people who are dead. He's still stuck in this idea that we can bring this thing that's dead back to life. And I mean, it's not just the religious problem. If you think about the opening scene of the whole show, you've got Rick trying to get gas for his car. And if you were to track gasoline, the story of gasoline and cars through the whole series, you actually see a really interesting like evolution of like, oh yeah, we're done with this old world, but it takes them a long time to figure that out. And that's actually part of the problem that people in the kingdoms still have, is they still think they're part of that old world. They're still looking for something that's a living out of something that's dead. And you know, that opening shot is all about, everything looks the same, but like, then you notice, oh, there's a car flipped over. Oh, it's burnt out. Oh, there's a camp. Oh, there's a little girl. Oh, she's a zombie. It's sort of, and it's actually a metaphor for, in some ways, the whole bit, which is, this is a dead world, and we have to rebuild a new kind of world. So I think that's one of the problems that sometimes people who are in religious circles have, is that they're trying to rehabilitate something that is dead. And, you know, if you think about Jesus, I was thinking about that verse that sets up his ministry. It says, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And then actually, I think it talks about them being in death, in the land of death. And then Jesus starts the first thing, repent, for the kingdom of God has come. So in other words, it's a new world. You got to leave behind the old to embrace the new. And I think that's part of the problem with some of the religious people. Now, Gabriel actually crosses a bunch of worlds for me, because I actually think he has a problem with performance. And notice that he continues to, like, does he wear the hat? Is he going to wear the robes? Is he going to put the collar on? Is he not going to put the collar on? And I was thinking that, you know, the show actually plays the idea of performance in interesting ways. There is performance that we think of as, oh, it's fake. I'm putting something on that isn't true about what I really am. I don't. But then there's the king, like King Jeremiah, who actually represents, I think, a very powerful performative act. You demonstrate a different vision for a new world. I like what you were talking about with Booth. In a sense, that's an artistic act. It's saying, I want you to imagine a world that you can now rally behind. It isn't there yet, but it could come. And the king is doing the same thing. The king is playing the role of a king with the tiger and the scepter, not because he genuinely believes that is his reality, but he wants to. He's actually, it's sort of talking about the kingdom of God in some ways, right? This is what could be. So you've got this one person who's performing, but it's fake. But Gabriel ultimately comes back to the reality. I put this on because it performs, it creates an imagination of what could happen. Like Danielle, you write in the book, he becomes a different kind of pastor. He still performs the pastor, but it's no longer a fake performance. It's a performance that inspires something new. So anyway, those are two interesting characters because of that.
Well, Scott, it's, you know, the other thing I was thinking about with that performance piece too, of course, is that it's not a new theme. It's just the theme of religion opens up to the conversation, because this is how Rick Rick's still wearing his sheriff outfit with his badge and his hat for the whole first season.
That's right.
Because he doesn't know who he is if he's not the sheriff. And you know, and then of course he becomes best friends with the guy that he was formerly enemies with. So like there are so many parallels about like identity and who we are and what we wear and what that means. And so that's, I mean, that was some of the most powerful imagery for me, is like, who are you when you wake up in this new world? Which of course, you know, for those of us who are Christians and we understand this theology of kingdom, you know, this kingdom where God's creating something new in the midst of, you know, in the midst of the apocalypse, in the midst of the old and the dying, you see that same disorientation, you know, like that disorientation of like, who am I now? Like, who am I if my value doesn't come from my job, or if it's not my identity, or if it's not the role that I play, or if it's not, you know, this worldly notion of who I am. So it's, and I think the same is true with Herschel, and the same, it's less true with Herschel, I think, in some ways, because he's more like a man of the land, right? So he's faith, yes, but he's also like a farmer, and he's kind, and he's like got these values of that. But I think definitely with Gabriel, you know, just it spins into this, who am I? And who am I, like on a deep level, like I'm different than I thought I was. I thought I was better than I am. And then also, who am I in context of the community and religion? And then again, like bringing open this like idea of like, who is the church to a to a surviving group of people in the apocalypse? Really great questions. Yeah. Really.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought in those early seasons, which I thought was a really neat arc, was with the character of Herschel. Like, he didn't want to let go of the idea that these zombies were still humans, right? And like that was the whole impetus of keeping them kind of in that barn. And I thought that the interesting tale of the arc of that story is when they actually make it to Atlanta and find out in the lab that everybody actually has the disease. So it is like there's this us them, you know, with the zombies, and Herschel wanting to believe that they're human, but then also kind of finding out that we're all destined to be zombies at some point too. I don't know. It was kind of an interesting idea, and I think like coming back to, you know, the church and those outside the church, you know, like sometimes it is this us and them, but then also just that realization that no, we're all, you know, in the same condition. You know, we all share the same struggles and we all have the same hopes. I don't know. I thought that was a really interesting narrative arc in there.
Oh yeah. It's so powerful. I mean, it's so deep, isn't it? And it is just a, you know, it's kind of like, so I was looking at a couple parables this week, just sort of researching the parables and stumbling into the same, you know, we can have so many problems with parables because we want them to make sense, you know, and we want them to make perfect allegorical sense, right? Like, oh, that's God. And then you're like, oh, but that's not God. And then, oh, but that's, so like, but the story is trying to say something. And I think for me, the story is provoking. You know, the best thing The Walking Dead did for me was provoke me to ask the questions, to go a little deeper on the narrative. And then I think, again, just the zombie genre in general, from the beginning, trying to say something to society, you know, just that social commentary, like a mirror back to itself. Yeah. And I think even just the zombie genre in general, which The Walking Dead, of course, leans on, but just even that idea of consumption as our death, like we will be consumed by ourselves. And the reality of, you know, the disease of consumption killing us quite literally, I think is something to pay attention to, because that's the original genre is meant to be like that, isn't it? It's meant to be this horrific idea, but also like zombies are brainless, and really what makes them horrifying is they don't care who or what they're consuming. They just have to satisfy this thirst for brains, right? And so, and in so many ways, like when you think through that genre and you think through our life right now, it is such a good reflection. It's such a good mirror to say, at what cost are we consuming one another? And when will we say so? You know, and where do we lose? Where do we lose our humanity in the midst of doing that? And what does it mean to find our humanity in a culture that is bent on consumption? You know, like, And I want to say like, no, but not me. Like I'm a survivor, I'm not. And that's the funny thing, right? Like everybody that watches The Walking Dead always thinks they're the ones that are going to survive, right? Like they see themselves in the ones that survive instead of like, oh no, I'd be like the first one out. I'm pretty sure. I have zero survivor skills, but also like just that idea, like I'm the zombie, actually, like I'm the one that has deadened myself enough not to care about the human price tag on what my consumption means,
Right.
And I think that's a big part of the whole genre, the whole zombie genre, but specifically that's one of the things I think that matters.
Yeah. And it's interesting you're saying that, Danielle, because it's this notion of upsetting. My dissertation, a big part of the dissertation was really about change and how does theater change people, and it's really about good theater upends the patterns that we expect in a way that carries us along. If it's too hard, if it's too hard, then we just say no, I can't deal with this. But it's supposed to be upsetting in the same way. The zombie genre sort of does a similar work, right? It's meant to be. It creates a kind of upset or disturbance that forces us to have to contend with that. And interestingly, in your book, actually, I found some of the most that was this in the middle. You really sort of started to unpack some of the challenges, sex trafficking, and addiction, and it got very visceral, but it was also powerful. It was upsetting, but it was upsetting in the right kind of way. And even with the parable, that's what Jesus is doing, right? He's deliberately trying to upset their vision of the world, which is what good art does, which is what the gospel does, which is what good storytelling does, what good films do. They're designed to upset our normal way of seeing, and then to offer an alternative way, an alternative world, to unpack that over a slow period of time. And the slow burn is actually more powerful, like a book or like a long TV show. You sort of find yourself slowly having to unpack that. So yeah, and I think that idea, I think that's interesting, the thing about the zombie and the extreme violence. And for some people, I saw someone in the comment, sometimes it's too much. People are like, no, that's too much, I can't go any further. But it also can be this provocation to go, okay, I have to allow myself to be upset in a variety of ways in my thinking. And so it's an invitation into a new way. So anyway, those were it made me think a little bit about some of both your book and the movie and the TV show.
I was reading Shane Claiborne's endorsement of it. So Shane and I have been friends for a lot of years, and it was so funny to even ask him for. I never really thought it through, but I realized, he's such a non-violent guy. So violence is so he's like, I don't watch The Walking Dead, but I think like that's really the large section I put in there on just the sheer, like in the end, just the weariness. I mean, even like avid fans of The Walking Dead by season 5, we're just like, oh my God. Like, it's just like, how long do we do this for? Like, and then, they get ready to fight, to defend their territory or to take some more land or like whatever it is again, and you're just like, dude, like you just did that 7 times, this is not work. And you just get so tired of this like same solution over and over and over again that never works and just entrenches people further in, and it's, and so part of my idea around even the violence that is too much, which I would say if it's too violent for you, don't watch it. That's why I'm never like, no, you should really watch The Walking. I'm not a Walking Dead evangelist. I'm a Jesus fan. So don't do it if it's not your cup of tea. But if someone is watching it and if people are engaging in it, let's have that conversation about excessive violence and how it's never the answer, and that retributive cycle that never ends and only destroys. And what they're destroying, of course, is like the people who are living, like it's so, you just want to like pull, like just stop it already, you guys. Like you're the only, like it's you against this. It's supposed to be you against the zombies, right? And then it turns out, if you haven't watched The Walking Dead, that it's actually the survivors against the survivors, that they pit up against each other. And of course, we see this, if we're going to go kingdom of God, we see this everywhere where the church fights the church, right? You have these like Christian leaders fighting Christian leaders. And you're just like, why are we doing that? What are you guys doing, So anyway, so there's all that too, just that retributive violence that doesn't find an end, and
Yeah.
as a result destroys even the things that are so sacred and so
Yeah.
new.
And it's interesting that because I actually found myself at various points going, okay, I'm done. That's enough. But it was interesting. I found myself thinking about, it's the children in the show that upset the cycle of violence. It's Carl and it's Judith in a
Yeah.
variety of ways that have that upset violence. And it's actually Rick this sort of unpacking and explosion, is Carl saying, no, there is a different way forward, a sacrificing way forward. And it's noticed that it's that vision that captures their attention. And part of it's because he was willing to die. Whether he does or not, I guess you'll have to watch the show. But
Don't tell me.
Yeah.
Sorry for spoiling the whole show, guys.
Yeah,
who
yeah.
haven't watched it,
Yeah.
but yeah.
But that was there was a shocking moment there, but in some ways it stayed with you because of that. And he haunts, in the best sense, the rest of this time. They keep coming back to this idea, his sense of how things move, and it's just a very powerful way to think about the message of Jesus, which is about the powerful things, powerful imaginations, powerful visions, and powerful outcomes come from a willingness to die, to show something and then to die, and then that emerges in really very powerful rippling ways. Anyway, I was thinking a lot about children and even how Jesus responds to children. It's Jesus says, these are the kingdom of God, that it's them. But part of it is because of their ability to embrace the imagination of the kingdom of God, to see a brand new world. And it's the children in the show that represent and who can embrace a brand new world in a way that the adults struggle with the most. I mean, if you think about Carol's love-hate relationship with children is coupled with her inability to see a better world, right? And to the degree that she can embrace children, she sees in new ways. When she shuts kids out, of course, for understandable reasons, she also closes her vision down.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Danielle.
Yeah, you can see like children bring life quite literally to the community that they're in. And then this is an interesting, I think you're right, totally. There is something about the innocence and the sacredness of kids where people who would have lost their hold, and gone a completely different way, hold it together for the sake of the kids, right? Like, so there's this real sense, like the possibility of a future, but also there's something just about children themselves. So what was really interesting to me about this was in my own life in the downtown east side of Vancouver, living there with a little baby, and moving in there, it's sort of against common sense, right? Against common wisdom. Even, police officers would pull over and be like, I'll hop in, I'll take you to the right neighborhood. You must be lost. And I'd be like, no, this is where I live. And then just seeing the power of a child, the power of a baby. Like I always thought, like, we'll go and we'll protect this baby and do the best that we can. Like I didn't know that the baby was the strategy. I thought it was just like, we were going to like, I didn't know the baby was the strategy, and that the baby held the power. I didn't realize that until we were doing it. And there's this one time in my own ministry, and I saw this a lot in the book, just how babies, both the horrifying reality of children in that world. So that like holding that intention with the beautiful, sacred, moment of life entering, and, this being a testament, like a witness that life will continue, just the power of that. And how people almost find their sense of humanity, even just by holding the baby, right? Like there's several powerful scenes in The Walking Dead where this is true. And anyway, I remember walking through this, there's a Maine and Hastings, which is nicknamed Pain and Wastings. It's just a part of the community called the Jungle, where there's just like drug dealers and drugs going on and everyone's there. And it really is just a jungle, and the police go through there and they're like jostled by everybody. And even my husband is Salvation Army uniform with a Bible, like that's his best, his best weaponry. He would go through there and he'd be jostled and like offered crack and all the stuff. But I would come with like a little snuggly on with my little 3-month-old baby. And one of the drug dealers or addicts would just yell out, baby coming, baby coming. And then quite literally the place would just part like the Red Sea. Everybody would just solemnly stand so that I could pass through without anybody touching the baby, And it was literally, I just like the weird, like the most sacred thing I've ever seen, like a miracle. And then just having people, I just want to, wow, like what's going on here? And just realizing that the place that the power that children have, the power that life has, I think, and that kind of life, particularly innocent, they're not guilty of anything, right? There's nothing they've done. There's something sacred and beautiful and life-giving about life, even in the darkest of situations. And it really is a strategy. And you see that, I think you see that in that apocalyptic setting of The Walking Dead. And your question is, why on earth would you ever bring a child into this? There's all these other things going on, but at the same time, as soon as the child arrives, everybody's like, what changes everybody's life?
I love Daryl when he first holds the baby, like the outsider, and he's just like, it brings a meaning, right? It's a real powerful moment for sure. Why don't we turn to poll number 3, Terry? And this is another thing that comes up in the story is this, the terminus. I found that a really interesting arc. So this is just more fun, playful on our COVID situation. So terminus, we'll talk about this, but it's a community of cannibals.
That's great. That's hilarious.
I'll give Terry credit for that one.
Uh-huh.
It was his question. All right. So one of the really interesting arcs, like how long does Terminus go on for in the show? Maybe 2 seasons, hey? Like it's a long time. And so just for people that haven't watched the show, as this group is kind of moving, and it's very nomadic. It's almost like an exodus, right? They're trying to find the promised land, the place that they can go and settle and kind of rebuild, their lives. And all of a sudden they start seeing all these signs for this terminus, and there's this like promised hope of this place that they can all kind of go to and be safe. And as spoiler alert again, sorry for people that haven't watched the show, but they show up there and it's actually a trap. It's just luring all these people, to this place where they're going to be eaten by the other survivors. Just that idea of like hope, and then just having that the reality of this, evil. What did you guys make of that? That part of the show. I was really disappointed, that it wasn't the end for them. And like for me, I felt like it's kind of like there's a lot of things we put our hopes in, in this world, that aren't going to satisfy and maybe may even destroy, us. And what were some of your guys' thoughts on that Terminus episode?
I mean, I think for me, like, I think you're right. Like the whole show, it was such a brilliant show, in terms of theater. It was great because the whole show, you're just like, oh, they're almost there. They're almost there. Like they're going to make it. Cause you're also, but like, there's these signs everywhere that they're seeing going, like, if you want safety, come here. And this is promise of this safe reception and all the things that they're longing for, hospitality and welcome and safety and community. And so, and you're just like, they're getting there, and then they get there, and then not all is what it seems. So for me, it's like the classic false hope. It's a trick, it's just a false hope. And, in the scriptures, of course, it's like, that's the deadliest of all things, isn't it? Is that the deferral of hope, like the never coming reality of what it is you're longing for. So, and then it just turns into this like really kind of almost horror genre inside Terminus, right? Where you're just like, because they're not eating zombies, they're eating people, like they're right, like because they can't eat the zombies because it's affected meat, so they're actually eating human survive. So they're calling everyone to come to this community for the purposes of eating their flesh. So it is really like turns into sort of like the your worst. It's not only not the hope you were hoping for, it's the worst thing you're the meat.
Yeah.
So it's really like, it's so, and I remember that episode of realizing this, and I remember being so like horrified, like just so disappointed. And I think for me, probably the best parallel is just that idea that we keep thinking that this is going to be what it is that we, want, and then it's not. And then not only is it not, but it's worse, than what we had ever wanted. And I don't know, I mean, lots of people are saying, maybe it's a critique on our dependence on meat. Absolutely. Or that so many people view each other as just animals, objects to be consumed. Sure. I mean, even just communities that invite you in with all of those. I mean, I think cults, I think even sometimes churches are like this, where they invite you in with all these like, come on in, no holds, like you're completely welcome here. And then all of a sudden you get in, and then there's all these things that you have to do and have to adhere to. And I think sometimes church can be guilty of this too, where what we preach and what we do are different. But the disappointment level, like the literal audible, like horror within myself going like, no, like, I can't believe this is happening.
It's interesting too, because that's such an interesting question, Steve, that, it's interesting that because we kind of feel judgy, and there's a kind of, I felt a kind of like sense of like, wipe these people out. They're horrible. But it's interesting that so they justify themselves by saying, we tried to be good. We tried to do the right thing. Danielle, you mentioned this in the book, but that didn't work out for us. So now we realize that they use the terminus, but that they believe in a terminal world. So there's a world where things come, there's an end. So you must get what is terminal. But then they go on later on, that same group, to believe, because they believe that it's not a world that's big enough for everyone. So they need to kill people as well. Their first encounter with Negan seems justified, but really their feeling was, we can't live in the same world as these people, so we're going to wipe them out, this whole group of people, without negotiating. And it made me think of that verse Paul talks about, if you bite and devour each other, make sure that you aren't consumed yourself. So it's actually, there's a kind of zombie motif with this. It's, if we believe, if we're in a world that's all about consumption, which is what zombies are about, their whole point is to consume. There's a limit to things, so we must consume. Even the idea of mammon, right? Richard Foster does that beautiful job to talk about that money is not, it can be used, but never forget it's something that wants to eat you and own you and take you over and consume you. And in some ways, some of our friends in some other very close countries who are struggling with their role of faith and how they should play their faith out, I would say that some of the ways they're erring is that they're falling into this lie of consumption, that somehow we're in a limited world. So we can't be expansive, we can't give away, we can't let go, because then we won't have enough. Which is the lie that you're always frustrated with the people in The Walking Dead. Like, you think this is a giant world. Why are you like so, why can't you play together? But in the same way, we can fall into that even as followers of Jesus, even with the way we feel about people outside the church. Oh, I would love to do and connect with people outside the church, but what about me? Like, am I being taught? Am I being fed? So there's the notion that we get consumed with our own being fed so much that we end up, in a sense, consuming the space for other people as well. So it's a kind of deeper lie that we must be owned by the drive to consume, which means we have to eliminate other people along the way.
Yeah, and there is just something also sad, like, because what they've done is agreed with death.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there is this, but they're really just nice about it. Like they dress it up, but really they're just in agreement with the inevitable end and sort of the surviving pecking order, like, and so it is this sort of agreement with the way things are in the old world, but just dressed up to look nicer. And I think there is, I think that is a really interesting parallel too. Like, do we just dress up, but we actually, all of our values and the way that we're living are the same as the old world, but we're just dressing it up. And really what it's about is surviving and not building a new way, right? A new future and a new world. So yeah, I think there's a lot there too, but that literally was like the most disappointing episode.
I think the thing for me with that episode, I think it really turned the show because it really shattered trust. Like really after that point, you can't trust anybody, and I think like it's a huge parallel to our world, right? Like we live in a world you can't trust people, and trying to build that trust and engender that trust, with people, but the church, breaks that trust. And, and I think like people live in a world that they feel they can't trust people. They can't trust the church. They can't trust institutions. I real felt that changed the show, for the rest of the show, because it was like when they did encounter Negan, and the others, what other choice did they have at that point, really.
Well, I think you're right. Because I was also thinking like every time they're ever going to see another sign that says, hospitality here, you're well, and I think a lot about this. Like my friend who had just come from Nigeria last year was just sharing this, of her thoughts on Canada for this thing we were doing. And she said, the first time I got to Union Station, and I was dragging my bag up the stairs, and this guy came over and said, can I help you? Can I help you with your bag? And she was like, instantly, I was like, no, get your hands off my bag. Cause she's like, this guy just wants my bag. Cause she's like, from the world that I come from, like, you don't let anybody else take your, but like, what are you new? Like, have you never been here before? And then she said, but then once I was here for a couple of months, I realized, oh, I feel bad. That guy probably really wanted to help me with my bag. But I just assumed and you just see that that trust deteriorate. And then you start thinking, like, I feel like this as a Christian leader, like whenever I say like, oh no, it's free, or come on, like, I feel like I almost have to put price tags on things so people will actually believe me and want to be involved in it. Because if you actually make it free and, the promise is open hospitality, people don't believe you. Like, they just think there's a catch. Like, that's the cynical world we live in. And for good reason. People have come to terminus over and over and over again, right? That's what my last boyfriend said. That's what that group said. That's what this church I grew up with said. And it wasn't true. So we're dealing with the fallout of a lack of trust. Absolutely. Because people have been duped over and over again. So now you can't even carry somebody's bag without being a suspect, So I just think it's a fascinating critique even of how that happens, because we sort of go like, we lament it. Like, we're just like, what a terrible world we live in where no one can trust each other. But then you realize like, oh, that's how that happens. Like, these trusts have been broken. Like, people have experienced terrible, horrible, trust breaking experiences that make them weary and then really suspicious and hesitant to enter in again.
Mm-hmm. And that I love that, and I that's such a great story, because it makes me also realize, especially in the later seasons, that part of the challenge to the community is that many of them understand goodness and the way forward is to give. I can give to other people, but they really struggle with the gift of allowing themselves to receive. Carol can't receive. Daryl must leave on his own. And again, it's the children that draw them into the power of receiving. I did this great small group series called True Faced. I don't know if you've ever seen it before. Such great material, but it's about, at the core of it's about love, and the one of the powerful bits about that is learning to accept love is part of coming into the kingdom of God. And because there's a kind of powerlessness that is freeing to everyone involved. If I'm constantly going, yes, I'm part of the kingdom of God, and let me give you this thing, I stay in control all of the time, but I don't, but I send a message when I do that, which is, and someday you'll be powerful enough to give because you'll be self-sufficient. But instead, this gift of like saying, no, I will receive from you, and I will accept that I need from you. That is part of what I think builds up community and builds up the church. And I think we're seeing that in the later seasons of The Walking Dead. That there must be the act of receiving as well as giving.
Yeah, there's a vulnerability and a mutuality, and I love that some of the later seasons where even like Rick, taking on the leadership of the group, and then all of a sudden realizing, okay, maybe I'm not the leader. Like maybe there's another way to do things, like just even that on leadership and how community works, and all of the different ways that they try to set up community with rules, and then like a dictator, and a benevolent dictator, and then like an evil dictator, and then even Rick is a dictator, and who says so, and so all of those, I mean, it's just a real deep study really in even how you set community up, who decides, and how does it work, and what about exceptions to the rules, and like, do you not let other people in, or are you an open community? I mean, it's just so fascinating to even just think like, okay, we survived, but now what kind of humans do we want to be?
Yeah.
And one of the great themes of the series I really loved is the fact that no one can survive alone, and in their right mind. I thought that was really interesting. So you can survive. So this is where we meet Michelle, and she survives, but not really, right? Like not in her right mind, because we need each other to be human. So there was something really powerful about that too, that no one could actually just go by themselves and think that they were going to be okay. Because you went crazy. Even if you survive the zombie apocalypse, you lost your mind, because you lost your own self. And I love that there was no self-sufficient way to be human in this series, in this world, which I think is also true.
And nobody wanted to be alone either, right? Nobody wanted to be alone. You're always seeking that companionship with others.
Steve, I don't know if you want to go ahead.
No, go ahead if you want. If you have,
I don't know if you were thinking about leadership, but I will say for me personally, at a personal level, I think it was most impactful for me to watch The Walking Dead as a leader, and to see some of my own challenges and difficult times and dark nights of the soul as a leader in some ways come alive on the screen. Rick's walking away. Rick, like, enough, and like, I just want to take care of my kids and grow a garden, and I just, there's so many times I was like, yeah, I get that, man. Like, I'm sure Danielle and Steve, you both have, like, you get burnt and you get wiped out. And you're like, man, my family, and you're like, and yet you need a time away, but then like, you're finding your way back. I think that's one of the things about this show I love, is how do you find your way back after you've been hurt, after you've lost, after you've been crushed again? How do you find your way back as a leader? How do you change as a leader? So I think I found myself many times going, yeah, man, I get that. How do you do that? So
I really loved when Rick turned in his gun and picked up that was such a beautiful, I wish, and I mean, I think that was part of it, is that like, if only that was enough, right? Like, I mean, that was, it was, again, it was almost like a terminus moment in a way, where we thought like, okay, he's finally arrived. Like, we're going to lay down our guns. And then I think from then on, it was just sort of, the show had to go on. I felt like that next couple seasons was just the show grinding on. Right. And, but I love that season because I felt like there was a maturity in that too. I think there was a sense in which it wasn't even him walking away from the fight. It was him realizing he wasn't winning anything. He wasn't doing anything, and he wanted to build something, which I thought grow something, which I thought was really, really beautiful. And then that inevitable violent cycle begins again, right? And he's kind of sucked back into this cycle of violence. But
so
I agree. There's so much to relate to. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, Brent from New Brunswick asks, who do you think, or which character do you think experiences the most redemption in the Walking Dead series?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think everybody kind of has their moments of redemption. I think that's what makes the series so interesting, right? Is everybody, and I agree with Scott. He said this earlier, but sort of the season, because it has such a long arc, the story has such a long arc, that there's ways in which everybody enters the story, and as it progresses, you can kind of see yourself more and more and more, right? Like in all the characters, you can start resonating because the story becomes so familiar almost, and then you watch people get to the same place as a person before got to in a different way, so on and on this goes. But I would say for me, I think just off the top of my head, I would say Michonne is the one that has the greatest redemption, because she goes from like crazy, like, crazy and alone and suspicious and almost even like an animal. She almost lived like an animal to survive, and even the trauma of her own psychological, to, I think getting things better than other people got them, to embracing, to accepting people, to opening her heart, to, in a trust relationship. I mean, just all the things. Like, I think out of all the people, she probably had the most transformational story. But I mean, all of them had their own, this is the story, right? They were all being transformed. And all had different moments. And I think, Scott, I think you mentioned Carol. She's like one of the most fascinating characters, no doubt about it. She's the most complex. And of course, the complexity of Carol's story is partly because she comes from such abusive background. So her story of humanity wasn't like, it was terrible before the apocalypse. So I think that's its own, she didn't have a lot of faith in humanity prior to this. So a lot of the realities of how humanity sort of goes into survivor mode and treats each other so terribly is no surprise to her. And then she just kind of slips into this sort of like a cynical, terrible, I'm giving up on it all sort of worldview. And then you mentioned children really bring her back to life in some ways, and community, and Daryl, just like connections with real people who aren't going to be jerks. So anyway, there's so many, but I would say if I just the most dramatic that I can think of right off the top of my head, I would say Michonne.
Yeah. And you mentioned Carol, and I think I'm going to have to say Carol, in probably because I struggled again with her personally. There were so many times I was like, okay, that's it. Like, you gotta end Carol. Like, that's enough, Carol. Like, especially these last few seasons, I'm just like, no, you're done, Carol. Like, you're done. And I had this moment, like, my son and I, he can attest that, like, I'm just like, okay, Carol's got to go. She's got to go. But there was a moment, almost one of the last episodes, where Daryl comes up to her and just says, like, are you done now? Like, in other words, can you come back to us? And I got to say, it's funny, I'm feeling emotional about this, but like, I was so convicted by Daryl, because I was like, oh man, like, could I be that guy? Like, even after all of these choices over and over, and she just like wrecks the community and puts everyone in danger, could I still say, you know what? I didn't love the choices you made, but you're still family to me. I'll still give you a way back in. And so I think that is, for me, a powerful story, because there's so many awful things she does, but there's still a way back for her. There's still, and I think that's the part of the grace of Jesus, right? There's always a way back. Doesn't matter how far you've gone, and it's not like in theater, we would call it the tidy Aristotelian narrative, right? Like, you get up here, you either do the right thing and you have tragedy, or you succeed. you can just keep like screwing up, but there's still a way to get back to the table, you know? So that's my answer.
So Adam asks, how did you come up with the title of your book, and how does the gospel relate to the story?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just came up with it. I wanted, the subtitle is The Walking Dead and What It Means to Be Human. So that's probably like, that describes why I wrote the book. And the zombie gospel, I think it was just a nod to the zombie genre in general, just knowing that The Walking Dead was just one sort of version of this larger zombie genre that has kind of become popular, was introduced in late 60s, 70s, and kind of became more mainstream this generation. But so it was just sort of a nod. And then the gospel is sort of the remedy, that's the remedy to the zombie curse or disease. So that's that, if that makes any sense, the zombie gospel. Plus I thought it was a little catchy. I actually couldn't believe it wasn't already done. I couldn't believe someone hadn't already written this book. That was a shock to me. What now, based on its sales, now I guess I know why, but.
Well, I bought 4 copies. All our stuff.
Thanks,
here.
Steve.
I bought Scott one, and yeah. So I don't know if that increased.
No, it's great. I didn't write it to become rich and famous, but I just was shocked it hadn't been written. And I guess, and then I did a bunch of radio shows and podcasts when it was released. And one of the radio shows I'll never forget, he basically was just like, "Why would you write this book? Like, this is a terrible, terrible show. Like, this is a horrible, horrible," like he just was like, it was pretty funny.
There's a certain amount of guilt, like, of watching it, I guess, in some ways in Christian circles, right? Like, why would you watch that show? It's so violent, it's so graphic, it's so evil, do you think it, like, and maybe this is just more of a question of mission, like, is it important for Christians to engage culture in this way? Like, it was a cultural phenomenon, like it was the highest rated show for 4 or 5 years in North America. Like,
it was the first season I think was the most watched show in history. The first season. And so, I mean, for me, it was just, I was literally like, what is going on? Like, and also what are people watching? Like, and why are they watching it? So I don't think we have to watch everything. And there's clearly some things, lots of people are watching porn, and I don't suggest we go have a look, to see what's going on. I don't think that's a good idea. So, and I think in some places, some people would suggest this is violence porn. I've heard that before. And in some ways it almost is, like there is like a certain amount that's like over the edge for me too. Like, I don't think it's a good idea. And at the same time, there's the struggle, isn't there? That you're taking, like, if the gospel isn't relevant to a culture, if you can't speak, and that, I mean, literally, like, this was one of my conversations with like a whole generation, for example, who just couldn't even talk about this, right? Like, who, as soon as they said like, "Oh, I'm watching The Walking Dead," and like everyone, it's just over. Like, there's no conversation to be had. And so when I sort of had a little peek at like the show, and I was just like, oh my gosh, like this, we can't end the conversation at, "Oh, that's weird." We have to say like, "Tell me what you think. Like, what else did you, like, what's going on? Have you thought about like what this means? And like, how does this apply to your life?" Because I just think it was such a good window at some depth and some deeper thinking. So that I just couldn't. So yeah, I do think there is. And, I do say in the book, my dad, whenever I would go to the movies with my dad, afterwards, he would always grill me, like, who is the bad guy? Who's the good guy? Do you believe it? Were they fighting? Like, do you think he really was a bad guy? Like, is it like he just would go, and I would just be so irritated as a kid, because I'd just be like, I just want to go to the movies. Like, and now I'm like, thank God he did that, because one of the things I think Christians need more than ever before is to be able to view culture with curiosity, but also with critique. And we have not taught Christians to do this very well. Like, we've just taught because we haven't talked about this and we refuse to do this, then people don't know. They haven't been trained in how to critique it, to how to look at it through a kingdom lens, and to look at it through curiosity, where like, where is God in the midst of this, and what might God be saying to people who are watching this? And so we become completely disconnected and out of touch with culture, so that we're busy preaching something amazing over here, but it doesn't even connect to this world over here. And I think we just lose people in the midst of all that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, art, like the good news, must upset people. And it's not for people and it's only good for people who are already upset. I mean, who are the people most bothered by the good news? The people who want to keep things tidy, the ones who want to keep things the same, the ones who don't want to skirt, don't want to play with something that messes up the status quo. And Jesus is constantly doing that. I mean, I remember, I love the Dallas Willard reading of what we call the Beatitudes. You can tell I already have a Willard view of the Beatitudes. It's not a list of like things you should be. It's a list of like, if you're screwed up, if you're messed up, if you've been broken, if you've been then good news. There's good news here.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand good news. If you don't see the reality of what's struggling and what's weak and what's ugly. I remember the first time I told people this story. First time I ever did a public reading of an alternative way of doing the Beatitudes. It was a whole room of people, and people just started to cry. And I could feel the room going, oh yeah, that sounds like good news to me. Like, because they understood it was about people who are broken. And so if you pretend that away, then you don't understand, you don't understand any of the Gospels, because it doesn't start off in a beautiful way. And you don't understand why we need the Gospels, and you don't really understand what God is trying to do in our lives. So that's what I kind of mean. If you go back and try to prettify a dead world, then you're never going to get that. And we have to, I'm not saying, I agree with Danielle, like you need to know what your limits are. And if you've been traumatized, then you probably don't want to revisit some of those things, but you've got to be willing to be upset constantly. And you've got to be willing to like realize what is not yet complete, what is not settled yet. And then you're ready to receive from Jesus. And I just think that is the core of not just the gospel, but the way that Jesus delivers the gospel, and who heard it and who didn't.
I think there's something to me too. Sometimes I think about Paul's invitation to go to the Roman centurion's house, right? Cornelius, and his revulsion, his sense of like, this is unclean.
Yeah.
Like, and then I think I say in the foreword of the book, even like, I don't know why I was surprised to hear God speaking through The Walking Dead, because he's always spoken through unclean, marginalized, border, prophetic places. Like that's where his prophetic voice comes through most strong. So I don't know why I was surprised. I guess maybe it's just the Hollywood thing surprised me, but I think that's a really powerful thing to keep in mind, that in those places where we're tempted to feel, I don't know, like dirty. And I think that this genre was one of those for me in some ways. Like I was like, and then, just to hear the cry and to hear God in the midst of this, it was a rebuke for me in some ways, that I refused to engage with the culture.
Yeah, the church is reticent to be taught, in many ways, right? I think God speaks through a lot of means and ways, and Somebody noted that there's a certain Christian hypocrisy, with things like Lord of the Rings. You can see orcs getting their head chopped off, and that's okay. But zombies, that's
or the Passion of the Christ. The number of people who took their children for Passion of the Christ.
Oh, wow. We have a rule at my house where like you can watch all the make-believe people, like that's okay. But like when it comes to humans being killed by humans, that's where we sort of draw the line. So even in video games and stuff, like when it's humans shooting other humans, that's just where I sort of, as a mother, I'm just like, I don't know that we need more of that. But I totally get I get people's revulsion, but at the same time, I also get this inclination. Like I literally felt rebuked that it took me as long as it did to get there and to have those conversations, because that's what everybody was talking about. And I think we need to figure out how to critique culture in such a way that we're curious enough about it to be informed by it, but also not like taken in by it. Like there is a sense in which I'm like, I hear the cry and I can see the invitation in The Walking Dead, but also the answer still for me is Jesus. Like I know the perfect human. And I know, I have this way of being human that I've been invited into that is the answer to the deepest cry of your heart. I can, and that was for me, it was like, how can I help bring these two worlds together? There's a famous preacher who used to say, all really good preachers have the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other, right? So this cultural, to be able to take like, okay, I know what it says, but what does it mean? And how do I live it in this world that I'm in? That's the Christian assignment.
Yeah, and it's interesting that because I'm seeing some of the comments, and I certainly appreciate some of the things that are being said. I just did today. I did a little bit of training session about interviewing people because we're doing some audience interviewing, and I was training them, and I was saying, and they were talking about, what if someone says just something disdainful, like, can you push back to you? And I said, really, the job of the interview is to find the heart of that person. Like, what is moving in that person's heart? What is driving them? What is going on? Where do you see that they remember? What do you see that they're grabbing to? And I think it's this thing with the cultural bits. If a show, it's like The Walking Dead, if people are grabbing onto it, it isn't about like, oh, I endorse that. The point of it is to say, what is in the heart of people who are watching it that draws them to it? Like, what are they seeing of themselves in their world in that? And I don't have to go, yes, that's the right thing, or it's like, this is the way forward. But I do need to understand, like, why do they see themselves here? Because that tells me something interesting about how I can love and care and communicate with them. So I think that, to me, is why I feel it's important to engage with culture, is not because then I go, oh, I endorse all things in culture. It's to say, where am I seeing the heart of real human beings, and what does it teach me about how I can speak to them?
Yeah, that's really great.
Yeah, and I think somebody wrote in the questions, if I'm right, what is it about the zombie genre that is attracting people to it? And what are the theological, and I think someone's asking academically, so probably someone else is going to have to answer. But like, what are the academic sort of framework around, like, what is that specific question? It was a good one. I liked it.
Yeah, it says, something that interests me is that people love the idea of zombies. Why do you think this is? Why is this an interest? Are there academic theological implications we can be thinking of here?
Yeah, I think I could take a stab at this one because I remember at the turn of the 19th century, there was, which is sort of the pinnacle of scientism, right? The world was like enamored with logic and science, and but then people start to realize, wait a minute, like, there's dangers with all this science, all of this progression, all of this modernism. They started to see it. And it was in that moment when people it was the rise of what we call naturalism. And spiritualism was sort of around that same time. It was really like the Frankensteins, the Draculas, they were all a response to a world where people started to say, you know what? Like, maybe everything is not as tidy as you think. And maybe the world isn't just like logical, facts. And maybe there's something deeper, and maybe things are a little uglier than we think they are. And all this utopian vision is not what we think it's going to be. And so zombies weren't from that moment, but what has inspired zombies in terms of the horror motifs really come from that turn of the century. People are going, it's kind of like, well, I'm a Gen Xer. And so it's sort of like the return to authenticity, where we stripped away and said, oh, I'm tired of all of the pretending everything, or the postmodern moment, right? Where it's to say, I don't think your answers are as tidy as you think they are. And I think we need to unpack that, the Frankensteining of our world, where we pretend something is whole when it's not. And so really, I think all of these horror motifs are grounded in the idea of the world is not as tidy and clean and beautiful and lovely as you think it is, and we need to come to grips with that. So that would be my academic answer to that one.
Yeah, and I think like it's kind of tying into this post-apocalyptic, theme too. Yeah, the world maybe isn't heading, to this, great paradise, but there's some 0 point, ecological, nuclear, all these, disasters that are coming our way, and how are we gonna, live the remnant of the society that survives whatever this is going to happen? How are we going to kind of move forward? I think zombies are just fun too. I don't know. I think
and the two, 1968, George Romero, he released Night of the Living Dead. It was $100,000 to produce. It became sort of this like crazy sensation. Well, it was really sort of like a niche of sensation, but still, it's still a classic. I watched it before I wrote this book, but really critiquing the Vietnam War, and first ever feature film with an African-American hero, the male, which is also worth noting. And then he kind of saves the day, and then he's gunned down by a bunch of white people at the end. So there's these kind of two themes of Vietnam, and then also racism that are at work in this Night of the Living Dead, and just using this sort of apocalyptic language, sort of much like Revelation did, right? Which is an apocalyptic language to describe, sort of to tell some truths, to give some stories. So it's really an interesting. And then the second film that he did, which was much better produced, and it was in color. The first one's in black and white, is Dawn of the Dead in 1978. And he comes back and he does it again. And this one is really telling on the consumerism things, because all the zombies are just naturally attracted to the mall. They all gather at the shopping center. And somebody's like, why are they gathering here? And I think the answer is like, well, this is where they always came. This is home. So then that's where sort of, I think that consumerism thing, but why people like watching it. I mean, I think, partly they're scary. There's The Walking Dead, I think was just really good writing. It's just a really deep, complex, really well written, with a couple seasons or two that I'm like, that wasn't that good. But the first couple seasons for sure, just really deep writing. But and I think that's part of it. But I also think, I think people are dealing with existential dread. They're dealing with that. Like, I mean, that's why preachers constantly say they know the world is coming to an end. And, I think that, this is a real deep felt need in people's lives. There's existential dread. What are we here for? What is the purpose of life? Like, when's it all going to end? And what's going to happen then? And all of the things. Like, I think those are legit human questions. So I think there's something about the genre that attracts people who are drawn to that kind of thinking.
And it's also a relentlessness of the fear. It's a fear of a relentless danger. It's actually, that's why it's super appropriate to this moment now. Lots of great comedians have talked about, the joke is like all of the crazy things that happened in 2020. Like, it's not just one thing. Remember when we talked about fires? Remember when we talked about racism? Remember when we talked about and in that way, it's zombie-like. A vampire is something you can target and go after. But zombies are this, just how do you fight all the zombies? Like, you kill one,
it's
you
out
kill
of control.
10. Right. And it just is, and it's the swamping, right? It's a swamping danger.
Well, it's almost like in slow motion too, right? Like a vampire is like, it's in, it can do all these supernatural things. A zombie is like running at like 1/10 of the speed of a human, but it's like, it's not going to stop. It's just going to keep going, and and eventually, no matter where you go, they're gonna find you.
Right.
It's just,
Right. And if your fear in your heart, like many of us, is that you are a runner, you're trying to escape the dread that's chasing you, and you're just trying to keep one step ahead, the zombie story speaks to you, right? You go, okay, when's the moment when the jig is up? When is the moment when I can't do enough? When is the moment where I don't make the right choice? And then the day will come and the zombie, whatever our zombies are, will get me in that moment. And I think that is that is that is the invitation of Jesus to get off of that sense of like, you can be the hero that solves the thing, or you can run far enough, or you can build enough weapons or high enough walls, you know? And so it forces us to confront what we cannot do. And I think that's the nice turn towards the gospel, which is to say, but there is an answer to the ends of ourselves, our own terminus.
Right.
Great. Well, I think we should probably wrap up soon. I'll let this last question, be the last question here. So do you think, Danielle, what you're arguing in your book aligns with what the writers were trying to communicate in The Walking Dead? And would you consider The Walking Dead a Christian show? So I'll maybe let you have the last word on, what truths should we take home from this, or, how should we, take something like The Walking Dead?
Yeah, I do not think The Walking Dead is a Christian show at all. But I did think it was a show where I could hear sort of the prophetic, the kingdom, the questions of the kingdom kind of ringing, which I think is true in almost, I think you could probably watch any movie and then have a conversation about, some of the things that were offered in that movie. Like, what are people searching for? Like, what are people, where are the end of the limits? Like, what are people asking right now? So I think like all culture can be critiqued in a way. And then I think for me, I just got really curious about the massive response to it. That's what I was really curious about. I think I already understood the zombie genre in terms of like the social mirror that it was holding to the human condition and like just having us look at ourselves. But the fact that it was like such a popular show was fascinating to me, because it's not really, the zombie genre hadn't come into that kind of mainstream. I mean, now you watch, 10 years later, 12 years, 11 years later, whatever, and like zombies are they're just like a natural, normal thing. And now they're like kind of playing with the genre a lot and making it kind of cute and teenager-y and like weird stuff like that. But The Walking Dead was such a sensation, really bringing the zombie genre into sort of a mainstream. And that also was when Z came out too, right? Right around that time as well. And somebody mentioned in the comments here, it was right after the economic collapse and the subsequent recession, which was true. There was like, people were already like, oh no, what happens if you wake up and there's nothing left of what you knew? So I think there was just something really beautifully, there was a social commentary there. There was like an invitation to engage, not just critique the show, but engage with the culture that is attracted to the show and is asking these questions and is listening to these characters struggle with the human condition. And I think that's what the gospel's for. That's what the gospel's for, is to engage and to ask those questions together and to have a dialogue with a culture that's searching. So that was really, the zombie gospel is that exact intent. So yeah, no, I don't think I did. At one point I did know somebody who knew a character on the show, and we were going to try to do a podcast together and things like that. But then I left. I was in LA. I was living in LA at the time. So that was kind of a place I was going down. And then I moved back to Canada. So I said, forget it. Because who needs Hollywood anymore, man? I'm in the land of promise. But I think, I just think there's a lot to engage with culture. I think there's a lot of things too. And we should really always have our pulse on the culture. We should always be curious and ready to engage with the culture that we find ourselves in. So let's keep doing that. Let's keep doing it.
Great. Well, I'd just like to thank you, Danielle, for coming out. It was wonderful to have you. Scott, thanks for your insights. I think it was wonderful. We have a short survey for people after the event is over. You'll get it in your little logout screen. And then next month for our pub night, we have Bruxy, Andy Bannister, and Judy Paulson. And we're going to talk about, where's Jesus in the pandemic? And is there hope, And so I'm looking forward to that. But again, thanks for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for writing the book, Danielle. It was I think it's important for us to engage culture, and also I think be open as a church to see where, you know, our vulnerabilities and our gaps are too. And yeah, thank you for your ministry, and thank you everybody who came out today. It was I think it was a wonderful discussion. So
Thanks, guys. It was great hanging. Bless you.
all right. We'll see you next time.
See ya. Good to meet you, Scott.
Yeah.